Hello, and welcome to Real Life Renos, the podcast. I'm your host, Karen Brown, and in case this is our first meeting, let me introduce myself. I'm an aging in place and accessibility strategist. That means I work with businesses and governments to make their buildings more accessible for everyone. I also work with individuals who want to stay in their homes, in their familiar communities, for as long as possible. Since homes have never been built to work with us as we age or acquire disabilities, that means they need renovations. Sometimes small ones, sometimes large renos. Real life renos also means renovating the way we think about our lives, so some podcast topics are in that area. Today, our guest is Ron Wickman, an architect who specializes in accessible design. If you are thinking that downsizing from a neighborhood home to a condo is the right move for you, listen to this podcast and you might just think again. Hi, Ron. Welcome back. It's good to have you.
Oh, thanks. It's great being here.
Terrific. Well, we've talked an awful lot about accessible housing, and we've also talked about seniors wanting to stay in their own homes but needing to make decisions. You know, I came upon this bunch of data talking about older adults, and it seems that they want to move, they want to downsize. Their heads immediately turn to condo living. In fact, in Toronto, high rises are home to 40% of the people over 65 years of age in Toronto. But that's not always the solution that people think it is. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the first thing I can say is the stats would be, and I don't know them, but they would be significantly different here in Alberta. So we have a lot more single family housing stock compared to condo living. And there's been a bit of a slowdown with the pandemic and so on. That's kind of slowed the progress of apartment living, condo living. But we're behind a city like Toronto or Vancouver or Montreal in terms of that kind of living. I did. I did recently listen to a podcast that was all about Toronto and listening to planners talking about how Toronto has been planned. So essentially, it is a city, a downtown core with tall buildings surrounded by single family houses, in essence. And so there's lots of talk in most parts of Canada, kind of starting in Toronto, this Toronto area, talking about the missing middle. And the missing middle would be housing that is something between high-rise condo living and single-family housing. So anything from a duplex up to a low-rise apartment building kind of thing. So that's certainly something that we've seen here in Alberta, in Edmonton and Calgary especially. And Calgary's just growing so quickly now that this kind of missing middle has been kind of the talk of the town, so to speak. And that fits nicely in with something I've been thinking about for quite a long time. In fact, right since 1990 and 91 when I graduated from architecture school. And I didn't know the term missing middle. I don't think it had been invented yet. But essentially, my master's thesis was about that topic, interestingly enough. So it was all about accessibility, but it was about accessible living. So could we create communities and housing that would be more effective for people with disabilities? And my thinking was that at that time, and it still is today, that people living in that live in a 3,500 square foot house or something, of that size, a single family house, that suddenly find themselves either an empty nester couple or like my mom is now, just an individual in her early 80s, living in a bigger house. It's just a lot of upkeep, and it's hard to maintain the house and deal with the house and all that. But I know my mom would never want to move to the alternative, which here in Alberta would be um, some kind of long-term healthcare facility. So it seems like the options for the most part have been stay in your house or move into some kind of care home. And so there's all these options that we should be thinking about that are vastly different. And condo living has sort of presented itself as something that could be one of those types of dwellings.
Well, people think of it that way anyway, but it's
It,
not always suitable. This is not the forever home that some people imagine it's going to be, is it?
correct, yeah. So they like on the surface it sounds great because um, you have probably an underground parkade, so you can if you're somebody with a disability, especially in a winter city, which is mostly Canada. um, you can park underground. You can gain access to an elevator, and you can get to your dwelling. And so conceptually, that's great. Um, but it's the fact that the dwellings themselves don't present themselves with any real accessible or universal or inclusive, whatever term you want to use, features that would be adaptable to uh, different types of residents. So somebody in a wheelchair, for example, somebody with low vision, somebody with some hearing limitations, other mobility issues. The housing stock just doesn't really provide access to that kind of living experience. It's just sort of based on, I guess, what the developers and builders have thought is most marketable. So they do their homework and their research, and they figure out that if we build dwellings that are of a certain size and a certain number of bedrooms and so on, uh, then they'll sell, and that's the name of the game for the development world, right?
Well, it is. But now, can you tell us, because you know more about this than I would, and our listeners probably would, when a condo is being built structurally, what's happening that makes it difficult to make changes?
Well, in high rises for sure, they're built in typically in concrete, so it is difficult to deal with renovation work in a concrete structure. Low rise housing is typically wood frame, um, but it has mostly to do with our the fire rating. So every dwelling within a condo unit has to be fire rated from the other dwellings. And so to do renovations, uh, certainly renovations that uh, compromise the fire walls, become a challenge. Um, it because it's not a single family house and one structure, you don't want to tinker with any kind of structural issues. So you don't want to be removing walls that might be holding up many walls above it, uh, that sort of thing. So they can be very complicated and expensive. So simple modifications like uh, taking out your kitchen cabinets and putting in new ones is not really a big deal. But it can be a big deal if you start to want to move sinks or stove locations where there's an exhaust fan. If you want to move a toilet somewhere else in your bathroom or expand your bathroom to make it bigger to accommodate somebody in a wheelchair, that again might not only affect plumbing, electrical issues, but again, structural issues may be a problem. So all of these things make it really difficult from a physical building point of view. And then the other part of it is that condo living is ruled by a condo association. So it's a board of people living in the condo building that also act as a bit of a government, that they decide what can and can't be done within the overall structure of the building. And their decision making is primarily based on what is good for the collective, everybody that lives there.
Okay, so if they're making decisions based on what's best for the collective, and if 40% of people in condos in Toronto anyway are over 65, isn't it best for the collective to have some more inclusive design? So, I mean, you would think that
You'd
you're
think so.
laughing. You would
Yeah,
think so.
you would absolutely think so. Yeah.
But then the
And
design challenges come into play.
Uh, Correct. Yeah,
Right.
and then just all these. I guess they can be somewhat political as well. If we allow one resident to do this to their dwelling, then we set a precedent for others to do the same thing, and it could potentially create chaos, I guess, in the minds of the condo association. So playing it safe is typically the general nature of a condo association. Try to do as little as possible that would affect the overall marketability of the condo building for everybody. And the one thing that I need to say about condo living that in my experience as an architect who has worked on several projects involving condominiums, um, condominium dwellings, it's the outdoor access that has presented itself as the key major problem in all of this. So if you live on the third floor, it's not uncommon for your patio doors to be sliding doors that the the threshold of that door might be anywhere from 8 to 12 inches above the floor level, and that might not seem like a big deal. um, just have like a little ramp on the inside and a little ramp on the outside, but when you consider that in 12 inches you need a 12-foot ramp, a 1 in 12 ratio. 12 inches means 12 feet of ramp, plus you need a landing that's 5 feet by 5 feet. In fact, that's larger now. It's 5 feet 7 inches by 5 feet 7 inches. So that's on both sides. Um, Basically, your ramping situation would take up most of your living room and most of your deck to make that work. And the the patio door is considered part of the collective. It's part of the building. It's not the individual owner's property. So the bathroom is, the kitchen is, the bedrooms are, but the the exterior of the building is not. So even trying to change out your patio door to be different than everybody else's patio door, it gets a tremendous amount of resistance based on my experience working with condo associations.
So the bathroom is yours, but because of the way that the building is built, the structural implications mean you really can't change it.
No,
And the outdoor space and what leads to it is not yours, but
correct.
they won't want something that looks different. So, this 40% of people over 65 who were thinking that a condo might be their savior in terms of downsizing, they need to maybe think a little bit more in the future, because as we all age, things come into play, mobility issues, if you don't already have them. I mean, somebody with a wheelchair would find going into a condo very challenging right off
Hmm.
the jump if that
Yeah.
was their situation. But for people who think themselves to be in pretty good health, you start with hip replacements, knee replacements, back issues, other kinds of mobility issues, which make just movement around your condo apartment very challenging. And if you can't access your balcony or deck anymore, that's a problem.
Hmm.
So you have written recently in an article that the best design projects start with collaborations. There seems to be a
Yes.
disconnect between architects and builders and developers in terms of what that collaboration might look like. Who
Mhm.
are architects typically collaborating with?
The uh, architects will be collaborating with the developer or builder of the project. So, for the most part, in a condo building, you would never really, the architect who designs the project would never really know um, a specific client. There would be a profile of a client. So the developer would present a what we'd call a program to the architectural team to design any number of dwellings, right? So a 50 or 20-story building with 6 units per floor, um, one being a one bedroom and five being two bedrooms, something like that. Just you'd be given sort of the agenda as the architectural team, and you'd have to put it together in a nice package for the developers. And then more often than not, the developers like to try to then sell a good number of the dwellings before they actually start construction, so that they can sort of finance the project. At least that's my understanding of it, as somebody that typically doesn't enter that world as an architect. I'm usually the one that comes in way, way later, like 10 years later, when somebody with a disability has already purchased a condo and now they want to modify it. So maybe a little bit different today. I think there are more innovative ideas that are probably happening with condo living, but by and large, that's the way it is, right? So we don't, as architects, we generally don't talk to the end user of any of the dwellings, and in any way, shape, or form.
Right. One of my favorite sayings is when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change.
Hmm.
And I know we've touched on this before in one of our previous podcasts, but the idea of changing from a medical model of disability to a social model of disability seems to come into play here.
Yes, yeah, yeah, and it's funny that it's still a thing, right? This idea that the medical model, but I think that's the way a lot of people in the general public kind of perceive things, is that, oh, if I get an accessible dwelling, it'll look institutional, and we'll have to have all these ugly grab bars around, and it just won't be very nice. Everything will be white and very clinical looking. Um, and so for developers that are even more knowledgeable about accessibility, they have trouble marketing something that they feel should sell quite easily, but they often get more resistance than it's worth for them. So then they go back to what works for them, right? So it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So, like, certainly I would never want to be seen as somebody that is, anti-development or hard on developers. It's just sort of a function of the history of the way we've always approached housing.
Right, right. Let's touch on some of the other difficulties for people of a certain age and people with disabilities living in high rises. When we think about reaching them in a medical emergency or disasters of some kind. I mean, I guess Hurricane Hazel was the last hurricane to hit Toronto in the 50s, but
Hmm.
we do get tornadoes, fires happen. I don't really find, maybe you do, but I don't, that people who have disabilities and people who are older are somehow an organized group of people for those who are charged with rescuing them.
Yeah, yeah, that's often what happens, and I think the 9/11 um, event really was a game changer, and on so many levels. But architecturally, there was a lot of discussion and talk about what to do in cases of emergency. So traditionally, the elevator is something we don't use in a building that's experiencing a fire, for example. So we use the stairwells. And of course, if you're quadriplegic in a power wheelchair, that becomes impossible to do. So that's certainly something that uh, more people became aware of as an issue, and the result of that was that in different jurisdictions, the building codes ask for what they call areas of refuge. So they're typically in your stairwell, which is a fire rated space, and the landings of the stairs are um, larger so that you could park yourself in a wheelchair. You'd have access to some technology like a phone or some kind of emergency call button, something like that. So you could wait in there and hopefully help would get to you soon enough. But it would also the landings of the stairs would also allow people um, getting getting down the stairs to get by you, and so you wouldn't impede the people evacuating the building. Um, in Alberta, we don't actually, that's not part of our code right now. In BC, I believe it is, and I'm pretty sure it is in Ontario, although I could be corrected on that one. So we don't have a harmonized Canadian building code that really speaks to areas of refuge, and that's a bit of a problem. That's something, as somebody who sits on the Barrier Free Design Committee or the Accessibility Design Committee in Alberta, that's something I've lobbied for almost 20 years now. But it's just one of those things that just it does increase the size of the building and cost, and so there's some resistance from the industry into doing this. So it that's certainly one of the challenges for somebody, especially with a higher level of disability, like somebody who's quadriplegic. Even a power chair itself can be 350, 400 pounds. Then that's not even including the individual that's in the wheelchair. So it would be really, really challenging to try to get somebody out, right? You literally have to take them out of their wheelchair and just carry them down. So this is definitely one of the major problems with high-rise living.
Right. There's an article that I sent to you that I will include in our show notes. It was a CBC article that talked about a fellow who was in a wheelchair since the age of 11, had an accident at the age of 11, and is in a wheelchair. He seems to live independently, but in a high-rise building. And the fire alarms went off one time, and it took 40 minutes for anybody to get to him. What a terrifying place to be in
Hmm.
for
Hmm.
anyone. And I also see data from time to time about the length of time it takes for EMTs to reach someone who's, for instance, had a heart attack if they live on an upper floor in a building. And one of the issues is just them getting into the building. They start pushing buttons and trying to get somebody to let them in.
Hmm.
And there is actual data. I wish I could find it, or that I could have found it in advance of this podcast. There is actual data that might be outdated at this point, but that if you live above a certain floor, your chances of survival decline fairly rapidly, and it's for
Mm.
that reason. People can't get to you. I sound like I'm trying to scare people off of condo living, and I'm really not. It's just there's so much that people need to think about when they're looking to downsize, and not just having them look 5 years ahead, but having them look a
Hmm.
decade, 2 decades ahead to what their circumstances might be and what they might need. Does
Yeah.
it sound like I'm trying to scare? I guess it does,
Well,
but I don't mean to.
well, yeah, like I mean, I know what you're saying, and this is something that I've encountered for a long time now too. So I at kind of a higher level, sort of more a little bit of philosophy in my approach to all of this. In my early days, it was my approach was it's just the right thing to do. Like it's just like to just be a good human being, and if you're an architect, design for people with disabilities. If you're a politician, make decisions that make life better for people with disabilities. It's just the right thing to do. In the early days, I didn't think about um, societal attitudes and beliefs. I didn't think about money as much, at least not other people's money, right? Um, so you start to live your life, and you realize that there's a lot of complicating factors in this. This kind of right thing to do sort of morphed into being a safety issue. Um, not so much just getting people in a building, but also getting them out. So you try to approach it from the point of view of, if we don't do these things, really bad things could happen. And that it's kind of a message that you just mentioned it is something that we try to stay away from saying too much of, but these are realities, right? Like, nobody really wants to think that they'll encounter at least a temporary disability at some point in their life, like a broken leg or a broken arm or something like that. But um, almost everybody will probably have at least a temporary disability in their lifetime. And I would say it's got to be close to 100% of people at least have a friend or somebody they know with a disability. So it's part of our world all the time. And so it doesn't have to be just about doing the right thing or being safe. It can be um, uh, about just being, again, I guess, back to being a good human being as well, but just just part of our life, just part of the way we think about the way we house people, the way we work, the way we play, all of that. It's just got to be a sort of a natural part of the way we live and interact with each other. Um, Lately, I think around the Rick Hansen Foundation and other groups have really been promoting the economic advantage of doing this. Again, you mentioned the large number of people who are over 65, and that's just ever increasing. And the boomer population really holds a lot of and has dictated our economy for so long. So there can be a truly an economic case made for it, and that'll kind of tweak the interest of our people more interested in developing and building. Um, so it's kind of like we have to be able to approach all segments of society simultaneously to get everybody kind of thinking the same way, but maybe from different angles, right? So some people will want to do things because it's the right thing to do. Some people want to do it because there's incentives to make some money. Um, some people will approach it from a safety point of view. Uh, and what we need more than anything, I think, at this stage in our in the movement, if you want to call it that, or in our life, is we need more people with the lived experience to be speaking out more. So we need seniors, people who are over 65, people with disabilities themselves, to be more vocal and explain to everybody else what it's like living with a disability or being older, and some of the challenges you might face and some of the things that can be done to make your life easier. I do think that at least 99% of our population are willing to listen and want to do something that um, will make life better for everybody. Sometimes we just don't know how.
Right. I agree with you completely. And, before this, we were having a little chat about the how, but also about the fact that the people who are the decision makers don't really understand the why.
That's right. Yeah.
It's such an important thing for people to understand why things need to be a certain way and then how to make it that way. So, it becomes something of a frustration, certainly for me, I think for you as
Hmm.
well,
Yeah.
that when they don't understand the why, it just floats off into the netherworld
Yeah.
for them. They're sympathetic, but that's kind of where it ends.
It's so true. It's so true, right? And I can't help but think about my father being a politician. He was the why. Like when he said, I need the bathroom door to be wider because I can't get through. Um, it's not somebody standing there like looking like they could get through that doorway saying this. It's somebody in a wheelchair like physically showing you, I can't get through. Like, look at my wheels can't get through. It's like it's you don't need any more than that, right? And that's why I go back to this comment that for a long time now, um, I feel like I've been part of a group of advocates that certainly don't have the physical disability like being in a wheelchair, um, or being blind, that can really demonstrate. So I think a lot of people sometimes listen to me and say, yeah, but what does he really know about this, right? So they don't know the number of hours I've spent with people who have various disabilities. They don't know my experiences. They just hear what I say, but sometimes that's just not enough, right? And so we have to demonstrate how to make it work. So again, just sort of jumping forward a little bit to our this concept of housing is, again, the architects sit in a boardroom with developers and they talk about how they can build this building, structurally, how they can make things so that there's fresh air movement mechanically, how everything will work electrically. Um, and I guess obviously they'll talk about how they can do it right so they can make some profit. But I can almost guarantee that there isn't somebody, or there aren't a couple of people in that boardroom that are sitting in a wheelchair or blind going, yeah, but wait a minute, this is what we need to do here too, right? And remind everybody that there's this enormous aging population that would really benefit from this kind of housing. And once they see what it's like, they'll demand it for sure, right? So it's hard to demand something that you don't know what it looks like or what it feels like.
Right. And my mind often goes to people with autism. That wasn't a diagnosis we heard a lot about 30, 40, 50 years ago, or if anything at all. Um, but now we have children who were diagnosed with autism who are adults with autism, and their parents are aging. And so that gets into a whole bunch of perhaps sensory issues around the kind of housing that they need, because not all persons with autism are going to have to live in group homes. Some of them can live quite independently, but the circumstances have to be correct. So, we talk a lot about disability in terms of physical disability, but and we have certainly spent time talking about people with sight disabilities, people with hearing disabilities, but there's this whole other category that I think is set to come on quite strongly. In fact, the Rick Hansen Foundation has just added to their roster criteria for sensory.
Mhm.
I'm not quite sure how all of that is going to work out, because I think that people understand something about autism. Most of us now know someone with autism. But as the saying goes, if you know one person with autism, you know only one person with autism. Do you know, do you have a thought about where the sensory issues are going to play out, how they're going to play out in the years ahead?
Yeah, I do. I've been sitting on one of the task forces of the Rick Hansen Foundation, the technical committee. So I'm well aware of the time and energy that's been spent on upgrading the design standards and requirements that are within the foundation's accessibility guidelines. So there has been a lot of discussion about that, and I'm going to say not only that, but also all kinds of different disabilities have come into play as well. So in many ways, it makes it that much more challenging. Like it, I don't want to say we've opened up a Pandora's box, but it's like there's all these other disabilities that are human conditions that um, we need to consider when we're designing. And something that I'm sure I've mentioned in previous podcasts, but the designer, uh, our job is to somehow figure out the sweet spot in all of this. So you can design space that is better for somebody in a wheelchair, but might make it harder for somebody who's blind. So that goes for any kind of disability, right? So things might make improve one population's abilities, but might cause some issues for another human condition. So we have to become very knowledgeable, and that's a hard job for us as architects. Is we have to have a working knowledge of um, all these different conditions, and I know I spend a lot of time doing it. And I'm an architect who specializes in it, so I'm not, at the same time that I'm learning all I can about accessibility. I'm not spending time learning about other important issues that go into creating a building, like mechanical systems, and so I rely on other experts in that area. So again, the whole idea of the Verkansen Foundation was to create a kind of army, if you want to call it, of consultants and experts that could really help in all of this. But I do know that the issue around, I guess they like to refer to it as neurodivergent now. But it's true. It's you do a space that's good for one person. You've done a space that's good for one person. So trying to find something that works for everybody makes it really hard. Um, and in a way, this is a little bit an aside, or this is more of a design comment that I want to make, is that for me anyway, um, it's almost kind of come full circle. Like when I entered this profession, I was largely talking about people who used wheelchairs, and as I'm still in it and hope to still be in it for a long time, but I've been around a while. Uh, I'm kind of moving back to that area of design, is trying to make what I would call almost like an inclusive, accessible design that primarily focuses on people who use wheelchairs, because in architecture, that's the most difficult population to design for. Um, you got to get the space right, the amount of space that's required. Everything else can follow. Um, our choice of colors and textures and materials, our use of lighting, acoustics, all of these things can be done. But spatially, we got to make movement easier for people who use wheelchairs. So one of the things that, and again, this is just my comment, my opinion, is as we introduce ourselves to all these different human conditions, um, it gets a little bit watered down. It gets harder to do, right? So we've got to kind of stay on task and remain focused. Um, and so, in one way, I want to encourage people to think about every every condition you can think of and learn as much as you can. But at the same time, you do, at some point, you have to start to prioritize who your target audience is, right? So it's a challenging thought that I'm saying, and I hope I'm saying it in a way that's very inclusive in my language, because I care about every condition I can think of, but I'm getting fearful that we're losing touch with just making things spatially accommodating.
I think you're absolutely right, because you can fix everything else up to whatever standard is needed once you get the space right.
Yeah,
So acoustics you can deal with, colors you can deal with. You're right, the materials, whether it's carpeting or flooring and whatever you're doing, you're absolutely right. I don't
yeah.
think that that's a contradictory thought at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's important because I like what this is my experience as well, is we present all this information to a client who really has a limited working knowledge of disability, and just think how overwhelming that is for somebody. Like, oh my, like how do I how do I digest all of this information in one sitting, right? And I've presented hundreds of times in my career to different audiences, and this is often the feedback I get, is it's a great presentation, I've learned so much, but it was just too much information. um, and so I realize that sometimes I just have to focus on one thing at a time for each article I write or presentation I do, just to help the audience at least appreciate that, and then they can hopefully move on from there, right? So this is certainly something that I've been thinking a lot about in my work, because again, my work as an architect is very much focused on individual clients. So I'm working with somebody who might not have arms, and there's a completely different challenge there to designing for somebody with that condition compared to somebody who's in a power wheelchair, or somebody who's, we can talk about Alzheimer's, dementia, that sort of thing. There's
Right.
so many different things, right? So I kind of pick away at each project I do offers me a different perspective, and then I try to bring it all back into my overall design, when sometimes maybe I am designing a condo building where I don't always know the client at the end of the day.
I remember asking you on one of our first early podcasts if you ever do design for something, but you don't tell them what it's for. And you said, sort of sheepishly, why, yes, I do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think, but that goes to the point that you were just making, that if you try to give everybody the whole ball of wax at the same time, it's overwhelming, it's too much.
Hmm.
But if you can focus on one thing and then understanding who the end users might be to whatever extent, you can slide in some other stuff, be it color choices or materials to make things acoustically more pleasing, then that's what you do. And if they ask questions about that later on, then you can explain that later on, because they've already accepted the big ball. Now it's getting them to understand and
Yeah.
accept the other smaller pieces, and that there is a reason for it.
And that's a great segue into something that we should remind people of, if they haven't heard it before. I know I've said it in the past many times, but there are three key areas that we can really focus in on. And interestingly enough, if you get these three right in your housing design, it does actually benefit everybody. And that is what I call the no-step entrance, or like a wheelchair accessible entrance. So there's if somebody in a wheelchair can get in the front door, then anybody can. Like, there really is nobody that benefits from stairs that I can think of.
No, nobody likes
Like,
stairs, not
no,
toddlers, not older people, not
yeah,
people with disabilities, not delivery people. Nobody likes
yeah.
them.
That's right. So I don't know why we, and in condo living, usually naturally we don't have steps, right? Maybe
Right,
we do, and then we have a ramp as well, right? Because that's the building code.
right.
So that is just something that we can say, yes, it helps those individuals who use wheelchairs. That's where the whole idea of the no step entrance came from, was somebody who used a wheelchair created this concept that we refer to as visitability, which is basically getting into a single family house, right? I'm in a wheelchair and I can at least visit my friends. So if all my friends had visitable homes, at least I could go visit with them. Might not be able to stay overnight easily, but I can at least visit them. So that no step entrance becomes vital. Um, and then when you're inside a building, like a condo building, for example, and this naturally happens, is you need access to vertical circulation, so an elevator. So almost every building that's at least more than 4 stories will have an elevator, and most low-rise housing projects now have elevators as well. So the elevator kind of takes care of that. And I've mentioned this before. It's not that difficult these days to do a small project, a duplex or a fourplex or something, or even like a single family house. You can easily add a residential elevator. They're much less expensive than your commercial elevator, and they can just be sort of out of the way. It's basically, you're just looking at a door, and you open that door and there's an elevator elevator cab in there. And then more, oh, sorry, more
Sorry,
importantly than,
can I, if I can just interrupt,
yeah,
I know that on a previous podcast we did talk about home elevators
yeah,
and the fact that they have really not increased in price substantially
correct.
for many, many years. I mean, like everything, you can buy the Cadillac with, you know, the music
Yeah,
and the golden edges. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but a basic home elevator has not increased in price tremendously in many years, and that's one
yeah,
aspect of building where we've gotten a break.
yeah. And that's proof that there's been enough demand over time that it's kept the cost sort of, 30 years ago an elevator was about $25,000, and like you said, today they range anywhere from 25 to probably 45, depending on, all the bells and whistles you want to have. So today getting a residential elevator is more like going and buying a car. You can get a Ford or a Chevy or whatever else is out there. um, so you can shop around, and it's great, right? You have lots of options available, depending on your situation. And if you're willing to pay some money, you can have literally like a glass tube in your house that's very expensive, but sure looks space agey and
I was
cool.
going to
Right?
say Star Trek. It's what sounds
Yeah,
like Star
yeah,
Trek to me.
exactly. Yeah. And then yeah, just to really emphasize the third issue is the bathroom. And getting the bathroom right is really simply a means of thinking of it as a wet room. So you just make sure the whole floor and the walls are waterproofed, and then your shower area just has no curb basically, and so the floor in the bathroom all slopes to a drain. And if you want to stand in the shower, that's not a problem. If you want to sit on a bench, that's also not a problem. If you want a shower right from your wheelchair, that's not a problem. So other than maybe wanting to change out, you grow tired of your sink countertop, you want a different look, you can change that out. You could maybe change out the tiles if you wanted to over time, but effectively you have something that is really can be part of your life forever, and you never have to change it. And that just offers all kinds of choice in your life now. I can stay here, I can move, um, but you're not faced with a challenge that so many people I know are faced with, which is I can't keep living like this. I can't have a sponge bath in my living room. I've been doing this for 3 years and I just can't live out of my living room anymore. Something's got to give, right? And if they had a shower area that was already there, then that would just make all the difference in the world for them.
I will point out to our listeners that you and I have done separate in depth podcasts on each of these three topics. So you can go back into our archives or just search for them, and you will find details and prices and all kinds of information about each of these topics separately.
Yeah, and the reason I was saying it today too is this idea that when I am now talking to government, city planners, developers, rather than um, just providing just tons and tons of information for them, I just go, here's the three things. Just listen to these three things and leave knowing that that's all you got to worry about for now. And if you can get those things right, then depending on your perspective and how far you want to take this, that's up to you, right? You can start doing more research. You can come back to me. You can go to others, for more information. You can do a web search. There's a lot of information out there now, but people have to get their heads around the idea that there's some very simple things that you need to do, that are critical, and then after that, there's lots of other things that you can start to personalize, uh, for your own living experience.
That's really good advice. And it certainly speaks to people who are looking to renovate their homes because they've decided they want to stay there. It applies to people who think they want to downsize and what they need to look for in a condo, if that's your choice, or some other kind of accommodation.
Hmm.
It these three things speak to everyone.
They
Yeah,
do. They really do. Yeah. And the more I say it, the more I talk about it, the more I believe it. Like it really, and I've been working at this a long time, so it gets proven to me over and over again that these things really do work.
that's right.
And they're not expensive. They just really do not add. Obviously, a residential elevator to a single family house adds cost, right? $25,000, maybe $30,000.
Right.
Um, but
But you also don't
so
have to spend that money. If
yeah,
you can
yeah,
live, if you've got a two-story house and you can figure out the footprint on the main floor,
hmm,
that's fine. But
yeah,
you do need to have a way to get in and out of the house, and you do need to have a bathroom that you can use.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
You know what else costs money?
What?
Windows. Windows. They cost money. Just have like one window in your bedroom and then call it a day. You'll save a lot of money on windows.
Well, and but there are grant dollars available. I mean, that speaks to energy saving and so forth,
Yeah.
which reminds me that people can look for grant monies to do these exact accessible renovations on their homes. You should check with your city, your county, and look at federal grants as well because there's money out there. Not a lot, not as much as I think either of us
You'd
would like
hope.
to see,
Yeah, yeah.
but there's money out there. So, you know, plan your work and work your plan is
Mhm.
kind of an adage that applies to this situation, don't you think?
Yes, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
And that, so often I think what happens in this world is the world of disability is it usually hits people unexpectedly, like at times when they're not ready for it, and either personally or a family member, a mom or a dad has a stroke, or there's a car accident, or a child's been born with a disability. There's all kinds of things that just come very unexpectedly, and then all of a sudden you find yourself just at wit's end trying to figure out what to do and where to go. So that's really, I think, certainly as a architect and consultant, I can do my best to help. I'm doing these podcasts, do presentations, write articles, do as much as I can. But that's also where government can be way more focused themselves. I know governments will say they care and they really want to do something, but often they're words, right? And I don't always see a lot of action, to be honest.
this is true. But we are each responsible for ourselves. And as I
That's
so
right.
often
Yeah.
say to people when I talk to individuals or groups, decisions will be made. At some point, decisions will be made. Either you can make them or other people will make them.
Yeah.
So I think it comes down to how much respect you have for yourself and how much you're willing to take the blinders off because people get frozen around these decisions, not
Hmm.
knowing what to do or where to go. They get frozen, and that's a perfectly human condition. But
Hmm.
they need to stop that and figure out what their next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years
Hmm.
could look like. Could look like. Their choice. At this point, it is their choice.
Yeah.
At some
Yeah.
point, it will become someone else's choice, and they may not make decisions that you like.
Hmm.
Anyway, I think we've said a lot of very hopeful things for people. There are certainly lots of options, and that's probably a really good place to bring this particular podcast to an end. But as always, Ron, if you have any last words, I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to get back to this issue I mentioned about the missing middle. So, my final comment would be that the industry has to, and this involves government as well, but we have to create a situation where there is more choice for people. So, I think. I think if we really do, and this is where architects can really play a vital role, is really promote the idea of different types of living experiences. So we talked about condos, we talked about single family houses, but there's all this stuff in the middle that um, we need to pay more attention to and give more thought to, and certainly we're seeing it here in Alberta with a lot of infill housing. So, taking existing properties and repurposing them in ways that we can get more density, try to make things more affordable. That's not always working as well as we hope, but in all of that, we cannot forget that we are largely thinking about our population of people who are aging, people with disabilities. We have an opportunity to really redo that housing in a way that effectively is more flexible, adaptable, accessible, inclusive, universal. We just have to make it our mission to really make that happen, right?
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. Yeah. Well, as always, Ron, thank you very much for joining today on the podcast. I hope we've said lots of wonderful things that will inspire people, maybe make them think, and hopefully give them some things to consider as they plan their own lives over the next decade or two.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you to those of you who are listening and watching us. I would like to invite you back to our next episode of Real Life Renos, the podcast.